Okay, welcome to the 6th common session of Sunoikis Digital Classics, summer semester 2018. Unfortunately, we missed 2 weeks because we had holidays in Leipzig 2 weeks ago, and then last week, for various reasons, it was not possible to have our session. But today we have a session about digital prosopography, and our guests are Rada Varga and Gabriel Bodard. Rada and Gabriel have been contributing a lot to Sunoikis Digital Classics, both as leaders, chairs of common sessions, and as teachers. And today, so the topic is digital prosopography. And Rada, for those who don't know, so Rada Varga is from the University of Cluj-Napoca in Romania, and Gabriel Bodard from the Institute of Classical Studies in London. And the session today is about, well, digital prosopography. First of all, they will explain what we mean by prosopography as a field in classics, and how prosopography now is developed in the digital environment. And in the end, they will also talk about Recovid, which is good because we missed the session of last week. So Rada and Gabby, welcome back to Sunoikis. I think that Rada can start. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Monica. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me screen share. Okay. Is it okay? Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So today's session is on digital prosopography. And this is the outline of the session. First of all, I am going to talk about the origins and the development of prosopography, focusing, of course, on the prosopography of classical antiquity. We want to see how prosopography evolved as a field of study and how digital changed our perceptions on this field and changed the way we extract information and we get to certain results. Then Gabby will present prosopography as structured data and person and name annotations. And in the end, we will explain the exercise we are proposing for the students who are following this seminar. So we begin with the origins of prosopography. But first of all, we have to see what prosopography means. The first definition is the dictionary definition of prosopography. So it is a study that identifies and relates a group of persons or characters within a particular historical or literary context. So prosopography can refer to real persons or to fictional characters, but it basically means the same thing. The second definition I have put here belongs to Catherine Keats Rowan and is maybe closer to us because she was a historical prosopographer. And she says that prosopography is about what the analysis of the sum of data about many individuals can tell us about the different types of connections between them, and hence about how they operated within and upon the institutions of their time. So this is very self-explanatory, this definition, I think. This is what we mean by prosopography. In order to obtain prosopographical data, we have to have biographic data, and we also have to have data on the context. So we have to know the actors, who they are, and as well the links between them, which sometimes can be complicated especially for antiquity, but not only for antiquity, because we need very complete sources in order to get this broad picture. Prosopography began to matter as an auxiliary field of classical research in the second half of the 19th century. And it emerged and developed intertwined with a couple of other fields of research. One of them is historical demography. Demography is the statistical study of human populations, especially with reference to size and density distribution and vital statistics. Again, the dictionary definition. For historical demography and especially for antiquity, when we do demographic research, we are interested in the dimension of a given population, life expectancy at birth and medium life expectancy, fertility, and migration phenomena. Of course, in order to get this very large data, large amounts of data, which could allow us to undertake demographical research, we need to have information on the people who are the actors who contribute to this data. For antiquity, it is rather hard to separate the persons from the total of the population. Historical demography for the ancient era was quite fascinating from the beginning of modern classical scholarship, of what we would call modern classical scholarship, because of course it's very interesting to know how many people lived in classical Athens, how many people lived in the Roman Empire at a given time, how many people inhabited Rome. People are curious about this, and they've tried, and scholars have always tried to make estimations as approximations of this population or population groups. Modern scholarship agrees that around 80 million people lived in the Roman Empire at its peak, just as a fact. Another auxiliary science, which became a field of research in itself as well, and which was intertwined with prosopography at its beginnings and remained actually intertwined with prosopography, it's onomastics. Onomastics is the science of or study of the origin and forms of proper names of persons or places. Of course, in relation to prosopography, we are referring to person's name, not necessarily topography, places name. Onomastics in history is focusing on studying the etymology of names, which is classical linguistics. Then we have we are interested in the ethnicity of the name, with the inverted commas I have put on the slide, because a name can have a certain etymology. In the Roman Empire, a name can have a Latin etymology, but it is used basically exclusively in the Celtic area, let's say. So it has a different etymology from its ethnicity. We have to call it ethnicity because we don't have a better term. And this is important for prosopography as well, because it can tell us things about the place of provenience of a person, about a person's family, about a person's cultural education and patterns of manifestation. As well, onomastics is interested in the spread of names and naming patterns, and in their geographical distribution, of course. As I said, the prosopography of the ancient world began to develop, as we understand it today, in the 19th century. The first very important prosopographical work is Prosopographia Imperii Romani, which is just as important today, and which was initiated by Theodor Mommsen in 1874, around 1874. And the first volumes were published 20 years later, so in 1896-7, I think. What's very important in the context of today's presentation about the PIR, Prosopographia Imperii Romani, is the fact that it was interested exclusively on the elites of the Roman Empire. Mommsen's idea was that they will only include the senators. Afterwards, during the 20th century, the PIR has a very, very long and very interesting history. This is not the point of today's presentation, obviously, but it is important to understand that the last volumes were published a couple of years ago. So it evolved. It evolved as classical scholarship evolved. But nonetheless, even if in time the knights of the Roman Empire were included, certain even certain imperial important freedmen were included, the PIR remained focused on the elites of the empire, and it relates to prosopography in a very scholastic way, which of course which of course is very, very correct academically speaking, because it implies that we have to have almost all information on a person in order to do prosopographical research. Ideally speaking, this is so, but for the ancient world we have extremely incomplete information on persons. But using the tools that we will see in the next hour exist today, we don't have to exclude anymore the lower classes, let's say, of these ancient societies from prosopographical research. The other books I have put here are just as important for prosopography today, even if they are not so old as the PIR. They have been published in the 1980s, even 1990 something, the Prosopography Chrétien de Bas-Empire. Another interesting aspect I want to mention in this context is the nature of the lexicon of Greek personal names, which is a lexicon of names, as the title states. But it is very important as well for prosopographical research, and this is a question I think Gabby will go deeper with this question. Actually, what do we register and what do we research? A name or a person? The person and their name are connected. The name belongs to more persons, but at the same time it says something about the person who bears it. Well, during the last couple of years, the prosopographical research of the ancient world began to employ digital tools and developed in employing digital tools and online platforms, which make them more accessible and which make a lot of new types of research possible, as you will see in a couple of minutes. This is the online platform for PIR, which is not complete yet. It's a work in progress, but nonetheless, it's here. This is the online platform for the lexicon of Greek personal names, which again is a tool indispensable for somebody researching classical antiquity. And we have prosopographies who are not based on a book anymore. Prosopographies which developed online and which became an authority in the field exclusively in the virtual environment. As it is, we have the prosopography of the Byzantine Empire, this is another important detail, doesn't focus anymore on the elites exclusively. It registers all persons who are attested in some kind of source, of written source, from the period of time and the area involved. And we have other platforms, as it is Trismegistos, as it is Romans 1 by 1, which register all people from a given area. Trismegistos focuses on the people attested in the papyri of Egypt, and they are expanding this area. So a very interesting fact is that we are trying now in prosopographical research to go to the prosopography of the non-elites, and we are trying to expand as in covered area. We are trying to establish these connections, these networks, which make prosopography a further step than biography to a global level. Of course, it is hard to achieve. It is hard to achieve that, but as an ideal point. And the digital resources make this possible and more accessible than it used to be in the past. as I said, and Romans 1 by 1, which covers the people, all the people attested in epigraphy at the Low and Middle Danube, in the Low and Middle Danube provinces of the Roman Empire. And I think this is it for this introduction with the evolution of prosopography. Now you will be able to see how prosopography as structured data actually changed prosopographical research of the ancient world. Gabby, please.
Cool, thanks, Rada. I think maybe before I go back to the slides, it's worth unpicking a little bit more this question of prosopography and onomastics that you raised, Rada. We did discuss this when we were planning this session, and as you've just said that I'm going to talk about this in more depth, and I hadn't actually planned any slides on that subject. We could maybe talk about it a little bit here instead, and maybe I could start that by giving the disclaimer that I have to give every time I present anything on ancient person data at a conference or similar, which is that when prosopography, as Rada has shown, has a very, very specific definition and meaning, and it is also used in a slightly looser way for any database of people, of historical people. So by the official definition, the lexicon of personal names is not a prosopography. As Rada said, it's a lexicon of names, it's an onomasticon. But it is nevertheless a collection, a database. You know, the entries in the books or the entries on the website have unique identifiers for persons. They will identify individual unique persons within them and the references to those persons and certain information about those persons. So it is person data. And so when I use the word prosopography, I mean person data. And so prosopographers will sometimes get quite upset with me because I'm talking about other kinds of person data beyond what they like to think of as strictly prosopography. And one of these overlapping data sets, data types that we've talked about is precisely onomastics. And it is, as Rada said, inextricable from prosopographical data, because when you talk about onomastics, you have to, at least at some level, talk about the people who bear those names. One of the things when you're talking about the ethnicity of a name, that is based on the sum of all the people you know of who bore that name, right? You can make those sorts of the geographical spread of the name. It's based on individuals. I mean, especially for very rare names that may only be held by one or a small number of individuals. That information is closely based, a lot of the onomastic information is closely based on the prosopographical information we have. And just as when we talk about prosopography, we're effectively codifying and attaching various pieces of information about each person. And we're by necessity, we're simplifying that information. I mean, anything that takes an organic entity such as a person, even the limited amount we know about that person from ancient sources, and tries to turn that into a tabular structured data of any kind, is by definition going to be saying things that we don't strictly know and leaving out some things that we do know because that's the shape of the data, you know, table that we're putting them in. And one of the most important things that we have to say about any person is their name, or in some cases lack of a name, and in some cases multiple names, and what their names tell us about them, and what the chronological relationship of the names might have been, how they might have been called different things in different languages or at different times, and so forth. So sometimes we're talking about prosopographical data, or more strictly speaking, person data, and we're actually talking about names more than we are talking about persons. The vast majority of people in one of these non-elite prosopographies that Rada mentions will be people whose name occur once, usually in a very, very sparse type of source, such as a gravestone, or such as, you know, a signature on a papyrus or similar. And so we know very little about the person other than their name. And in fact, although we might have 6 different entries in a person data set for a person by the name of Diomedes, we don't actually know whether that's one person coding to 6 people or somewhere in between, because the nature of the sources can just be such that we don't know when co-reference occurs in the worst case. And so the difference then between an onomastic record and a prosopographical record really blurs to something very, very hard to divide. So that may be as much as I wanted to say, except just as I say, as a warning that I will be occasionally talking about various other kinds of person data, including name data, when I say prosopography. I'll try to say person data instead of prosopography as I go forward. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that, Rada, or anyone else for that matter?
No. Okay.
All right. I'll share my screen then and go to my back to the slides. Can you all see the slides okay? Great.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'll talk about then the treating person data as structured data, and I'll talk about it in under 5 broad headings. Firstly, I'll go back to some of the examples that Rada already gave and look at how already on paper person data is being treated as structured data. By the definition of prosopography, you are structuring person data. It's not just a biographical dictionary or similar. There has to be some slightly more structured, what some prosopographers call the questionnaire. What are the questions that you're asking about each person? I'll talk then about tabular data, so database type data, and one particular kind of database structure for prosopography, which is factoid prosopography, which is very useful. I'll talk about graph data, which is a slightly different kind of database. I'll talk about ordered text objects, which is just a fancy way of saying, encoded prosopography in a text format such as XML. And I'll briefly talk about linking prosopographical data to sum that up. So Rada's already talked to you about the Prosopography Imperii Romani, one of the oldest classical prosopographies, and in one record, such as this record for person number R100, Rossius Regulus, you can already see that there is some kind of structured data in here. It's presented more or less in prose, but there is data in here which we could pull out as structured data if we wanted to take this information and put it into a database. This information, of course, already is in a database, which is what is behind the books, and so the date information and such things like this are recorded separately, but we don't have access to them, which makes this quite a good example for just looking at this and imagining what a database might look like. And the digital version of the Prosopography Imperii Romani that we've already seen, all it tells you about Rossius Regulus is in fact that they are PIR second edition R100. And it won't even tell you the dates or any other information about that person. So that doesn't help us imagine that data structure. An example which is maybe slightly clearer is another example we've already seen, the Prosopography Chrétienne du Bas-Empire. And in this volume, this is just a scan of the print volume, which I took down off the shelf in the library. This is not a database view. This shows you already some of the layout on the page here shows you the concept of this as structured data. So you've got the name on the top left there, you've got some dating information on the top right, you've got title information included in there, you've then got the prose, which contains some kind of structured information, and the references, the ancient sources are given in footnotes at the bottom there. So that this data is already structured by its layout on the page, as you can see. The Lexicon of Greek Person Names is another good example of this. This has always been a digital project since it was founded in 1972, but it appeared only in print up until about 10 years ago. And the print entry for a person looks like this, or rather this is the print entry for a name in one particular volume. And you can see on this page 10 persons referred to within that name record. And in what each of these is structured, it's very, very sparse, but it is structured. It tells you that there is a person of such a name. It tells you where that person is from. It tells you some information about the publication and the date information of each person. The information you get in the book is in fact exactly the same as the information you get on the web view of these persons. And if we look at Zeno number 2 in here, you can see how this information has been tabulated in their underlying data source and therefore given to us in this useful form on the website, and has been simplified and really, concentrated into a very shallow, not shallow at all, but a very simple to a dense, hard to read line of text in the print volumes above that. So this is all structured data, again, traditional structured data as it looks in print. So prosopography is structured data anyway. Once you start tabulating this data, when I say tabular data, I mean putting it in a database. A database is made up of one or more tables, and so it's called tabular data. You really start making explicit this structure, and so while there is always a conceptual table involved in the questionnaire that is behind a classical prosopography, there's a literal table of data in a database. A database gives you a high degree of control over the structure of the table, so you can't repeat cells that are not repeatable in the template. A database gives you very powerful search, sorting, filtering functions, and it enables you to do these at scale. So even if you have millions of entries in a database, you can usually extract information from it very quickly, which can be very hard to do in almost any other format, digital or otherwise. Databases have very low tolerance for inconsistency, which can be a good thing because it can force you to be consistent, and prosopographers are trying to be consistent, but it also can lead to a lack of flexibility, which, as we know with humanities data, especially with ancient data, we will find exceptions. We will find things we want to treat differently from the norm. And the database tends to evidence this very top-down design. Therefore, you've designed the database and then you have to force the data into it, as opposed to starting with the data and then loosely adding structure to that in a separate way. All of which are good things, of course, but there's limitations as a result of them. And because tabular databases usually don't just have one table with every single piece of information in it, they will tend to have a relational relationships between multiple tables of data. This can help to emphasize the repetition in data and also the relationships between different entities in that data. And I'll show you a couple of examples just of how that works. So I'm using a spreadsheet as an example because a spreadsheet is in fact the simplest type of database. It is a one table database, and this is one table then with some prosopographical information in it. It has some persons on the left, it has that person's dates, has some affiliation information, has occupation information, a bibliography, and various other bibliographical records such as PIR references and Wikidata references and so forth. So it's a database that has multiple fields about the persons inside it. This, because it's a very simple one table database, this spreadsheet can be represented as plain text in comma separated values, such as this, and this enables you to process this in all sorts of very, very simple ways. You don't need to have any specific database software in order to do so. The more complex database, however, and in reality any database, will use this relational form that I've talked about. So in a relational database, you don't have all the information in a single table. You have each person referenced in a single table, in this prosopographic example, and then some of those fields in that table, some of the columns in that table, contain pointers to other tables. So in this case, the affiliation column, rather than containing the word Britannia, should be seen as being a link to row 3 in this other table that I've superimposed over it, which tells us more about Britannia. And it might tell us the coordinates of Britannia, it might have some description of it, it might give us links to references to Britannia in other databases, and so forth. So we don't need to give that information about Britannia every single time a person from Britannia appears, which is useful because this is a database of some 300 people, the vast majority of whom are in fact from Britannia. So it would be very cumbersome. So it helps to impose consistency, it helps to remove redundancy, helps to remove the possibility of making huge mistakes in referencing Britannia as being Pleiades 981513 300 times, and so forth. Almost any relational database will have, several or even dozens of such tables for all sorts of information that is controlled both within the main table and within other tables. So anywhere where vocabulary can be controlled, you would probably have another table with the controlled values for that information. One example, as I said, of a database of a database design for prosopography is a design called the Factoid Model, which was created by John Bradley and various other colleagues at the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London in the early 2000s and onwards. And in the Factoid Model, although it's a prosopographical model, it's not a database where a person record sits at the center of this graph and every other kind of information is about the person. It's a database in which the sources and the claims in those sources are the center of the database, and every other piece of information in the database is based on those source records. And you therefore have sources that tell you a person exists, you have sources that tell you a person's name, you have sources that tell you about events in a person's life, you have sources that tell you about geographical affiliations of a person, and all of those sources, all of those claims are combined to give you the record for that person. So in a sense, there isn't a person record at all. What there are is many source records, and each source or each statement, factoid as they call them, can tell us about multiple persons, but can also tell us about multiple places and can also tell us about multiple events, are grouped together to create this person record based from this. And this has all the power of a database model that we've talked about, and in addition, it enables you to move in all sorts of different directions through your data. In particular, if you start with a person record, you see the places associated with that person. You can very quickly move to other persons associated with those places, or other persons attested in the same sources, other persons who were involved in the same events, and so forth. So this is quite a powerful model, and several databases, including the Prosopography of the Byzantine World that we've seen, are based on this. And there's a couple of examples in the next slide just of how this factoid model works. So in the entry for Leon Diabatenos in the BBW, we don't have a single record for the person. What we have is a reference to this person in a dozen or so different sources. And some of these are in the same source but in different parts, so that they're in the different factoids within this. And so in the first example, there are four different factoids that tell us things about this person's life. There are 5 different factoids that tell us about dignities or offices that this person held, and so forth. And so all of this helps us to build up a picture of the person from the ancient sources. And bear in mind that everything we know about this person is from ancient sources. This is a very transparent way to record this bibliography. Another example, if you're interested, I won't go through this in any detail, but you might want to look at is the Prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England, which is one of the first and biggest prosopographies that used and helped to develop the factoid model in the way that it's used. There is also, this is in your bibliography, a resource at the King's College London website written by John Bradley explaining what factoid prosopography is and where it might go from here. So the third kind of database that I wanted to briefly mention is the graph database. And this is a database where, rather than being made up of multiple tables, it's made up of entities and the relationships between those entities. And it may be, this is quite usefully expressed in linked open data languages such as RDF, but it needn't be. It can be expressed in core database software as well. So what you have in a visualization like this helps to show is that you have a person record, and this person record may be associated with one or more places, may have bonds with one or more other persons. So going back to person record, the person record will be attested in various ancient sources. The person will have one or more personal names, and various other kinds of information about each person. So the person record can have lots of various other relationships within this. Likewise, you could express the factoid model in a graph database by simply having the attestation, the ancient information at the core of this network, rather than the person at the core of it. And this sort of graph database really comes into its own when you're looking at things like this, when you're looking at creating networks of person and other information. And so what you see here is a network of persons, and the relationships between them, and the size of the bullet that makes up each person is indicates the person has more connections, and the thickness of each line that represents these connections represents the number of connections between any two persons. So Pachumis and Orsenufis have this very thick blue line between them. This indicates that they have a lot of connections between them. Now, the reason that a graph database has helped us to create this visualization is that these relationships are not direct relationships from person to person necessarily. It's not that Pachumis is the brother of Orsenufis, but also has 9 other kinds of relationship with Orsenufis. It's rather that the relationship is via another connection. In this case, it's through being co-signatories on contracts, I think, in Rome and Egypt, but it may be any kind of relationship. It could be to do with relationship being from the same place, could be through having relationships to people in common, could be other kinds of relationships. And the entity that comes between Pachumis and Orsenufis is made invisible in this network, because what we're interested in is the fact that there's a relationship between them. But the kind of network structure that the graph database gives you really gives you the information that enables these sorts of visualizations, these sort of networks to be built. And I stress the network more than the visualization, because there are other ways to use these networks in addition to visualizing. The visualization is just pretty in many ways. And the final thing, the final example I wanted to give just very quickly of ways of recording person data or prosopographical data is in this ordered text objects. And the example I'll use for this is the Text Encoding Initiative's Prosopography module. Note that they chose not to call this prosopography, possibly for the same reason that I tried to talk about person data, although inventing a new word, personography, may not have been the most useful way to be transparent about that. So they have defined a person element with a whole bunch of new elements that can appear within it for defining person information. So here's an example of a simple piece of person information. We have a person who has an identifier. They have a name, Simon, son of Richard. They have a residence, which is in this case is a region. And they have Floroit, which has before and after, or not before and not after dates associated with it. A slightly more detailed and classical example, this may be one of the same people we saw in my earlier example, people from Britannia. This person element again has an identifier, has a name, has Floroit with date information associated, has affiliation, And you see here that as well as having text content, these elements also contain disambiguation information in attributes. So this Floruit AD69281 is given in standard W3 recognized format, so that you can perform computation on these pieces of information as well. So all of the same kind of information that you might get in a database, but with a lot less of the imposed structure, because if you have multiple occupations, you can just have multiple in there. If you have none at all, you can leave it out. If you have a way to control the vocabulary in your occupation elements, you can do so with attributes. If you don't, as in this case, you can leave that sort of information out. So again, it gives you quite a lot of structure and quite a lot of flexibility, but not as much control and not as much imposed structure as the database model we've been talking about. And finally, for this section, I wanted to talk about the potentials for networking large collections of ancient person data. And for this, I'm going to mention the SNAP project, Standards for Networking Ancient Prosopographies, which is designed very much for capturing a small subset of not really prosopographical data, but of the very common structured data about persons for interchange between projects and for common searching across multiple databases of information. So here is a list of the kinds of information that the SNAP guidelines recommend be shared with other projects, and it's a very small amount of data, as you can see. For the information about the person, it's effectively name, attestations, disambiguators such as place, date, and titles, relationships with other persons, and other identifiers, which are very useful for helping you to disambiguate persons if the person has a Wikipedia identifier, or if the person appears in the Virtual Internet Authority file, or if a person has a PIR number or an LGPN number. Knowing that can really help you to figure out whether two databases are talking about the same person. And this enables you then to share this information and to search across multiple data sets in various ways. And so it has a very simple data structure. This is by no means would the data that is captured by SNAP be considered rich enough to be called prosopography, but it really does, it helps for this sort of networking of person information across multiple data sets. So that's as much as I wanted to say about structured data and prosopography. I want to talk a little bit about annotation in a moment, but did anyone want to jump in with any questions or comments on that before I move on?
Yes, if you don't mind, I would like to add the comments because I think that this effort to define prosopography is very, very interesting, and maybe we can say that prosopography is structured onomastics in some ways, as far as I see, because this is the effort to connect personal data, or I don't know. We don't need to find other definitions, but prosopography as structured data or as structured onomastic. And maybe I can mention the example of Athenian prosopography. If you look at printed editions, so at the beginning of the 20th century, Johannes Kirchner published the Prosopography Attica. At the time, and it was really a list of names with sources. But at the time, of course, they already had the inscriptions and papyri, but not enough. Then it's interesting to see that in the 70s, John Davis published a book about Athenian property families, not a prosopography, but a description, of course, of upper classes, because in our sources we have information about important people. This is a limit. Then in the 90s, we have other projects. We have the Lexicon of Greek personal names, so we have another term, the Lexicon. And then we have the other project by John Trail, Persons of Ancient Athens. And then as a subtitle, a prosopography, but the main title is Persons of Ancient Athens. Again, the perspective is a bit different. Also because through the decades, classicists have been collecting many papyri, new inscriptions with a lot of prosopographical data for exploring also not important people. And nowadays, definitely, as for other fields in classics, the idea is to go beyond the most important people and try to explore everything. And now in a digital environment, I think we can really expand this, because in a relational database, we can really build prosopography in the sense that we can connect these databases and we can really structure onomastics. So I think this is very interesting. So sorry for this parenthesis. Thank you for trying to distinguish between prosopography and onomastics, because this is important. And yeah, so this was just, and then of course I can mention the example of Athenian onomastics and prosopography, because I know a bit about it, but we have many examples. So,
yeah. No, I mean, when we start talking about all these various different sources and databases and publications, we do have to start talking about name and person database or name and person catalog rather than prosopography. And that is loose enough to include prosopographies, but there are things that don't quite fit this sort of concrete definition, which is such as prosopography should have some geographical and/or chronological coherence, which a lot of these very large person databases don't necessarily have. They bring together people who might never have met. I mean, you could have a database of slaves, every known slave in the historical record across multiple cultures, across multiple centuries, and that wouldn't really be a prosopography in the same sense, even though it's tightly constrained. It doesn't have this single, geographical and chronological constraint that prosopographers like to have.
And also because for obvious limits, in the end, we have list of names, as in the case of names. Sometimes it's possible, for example, for Roman slaves working for emperors, scholars have been trying to build families of slaves, but in general, it's difficult really to describe their lives. But in any case, to get the evidence of their name. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I think it's very fascinating discussion. But now you can go on. So, yeah, I think it's Rada. Yeah.
No, it's back to me again.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, sure. I just I wanted to have a break between those two sessions because there is a bit of a break in content here. So I wanted to actually let me not do that. Let me go back to the slides just for a second, because in the slides I did want to talk about the concept of annotation, and I'm partly coming to this because annotation is very useful for names, and partly because the session on annotations that was scheduled for last week was, as you mentioned at the beginning, was cancelled. So I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by annotation here, and pretty much everything I say here about names, about personal names, could also be used to talk about place names. And so I'll in fact be showing exactly the same piece of software that Chiara and Valerio would have showed last week and have shown in the past in other Sunoikis sessions. Annotation of names in a text is effectively taking a text like this, which is unstructured data, and adding annotations to these, so typed annotations. So in this example, I have annotated all of the place names, all of the explicit place names in this short piece of text, and then I would added typed by being in a different color, annotation of all the explicit personal names in this piece of information. These are not all the place references and all the person references, but they're all the explicit names within the text, and these are annotated in a typed way. And you can see how now that I've annotated these, and there's type information captured by the color, this is now structured data. right? This is structured data in the sense of the XML I showed earlier was structured data, and also in the sense that it could easily be extracted into a database. You could say there is a place, ubia, which appears in line 1 of text X, and various other structured information about that could be added. So when we talk about annotation, this is effectively what we mean. There are various standards and online tools for annotation. Hypothesis is one tool which we've looked at in one of the Sunoikis sessions last semester, and the tool which we've talked about. This I'm sure was mentioned in the very first Sunoikis Digital Classics session ever. It was certainly mentioned in the first semester ever. The Rekogito tool from Pelagios. And this is the tool that I'm going to show. So I will switch to sharing a different screen now. When you get to that Rekogito link that I showed on the previous slide, you will get the page that you saw on that slide, and if you log in, or if you create an account, if you have never logged in before, and then log in, you will reach a page that looks something like this. It'll have your name in the top left rather than mine, and it probably will have no documents down there until you have either uploaded some documents or started working on some other documents that you've found. But you will, in any case, be able to annotate these documents in various ways. And I just want to very quickly show the interface of Rekogito as an annotation tool. And I'm going to focus. Rekogito is designed for annotating places, so it will give you lots of help when you try to annotate places in your text, but it can also be used for annotating persons, which is what I'll look at in the example. So one example here just of a Greek text. I'm going to do an example first of annotating a name rather than a person information. So in the heading of this document, we have the word kuru, which, as you can see, I've already annotated by saying that this is a name and by saying that this is a form of the name kuros. So I've given onomastic information to that annotation. Okay, and it seems not to be letting me create new onomastic information, possibly because I'm not logged in. But nevertheless, this is a document that you could get to, but for some reason it's not letting me annotate it. But that's okay. I don't particularly want to annotate it at this point. I just want to show what these annotations are. So if I go back to my other example, I've shared this document. I haven't already annotated anyone in that. Okay, I'll go back to Xenophon. Yep, no Xenophon. Maybe I'll have to log in. Apologies for that. Rekogito does log you out remarkably quickly. I was logged in at the beginning of this session. So okay, I'll go back to the Metamorphoses then, as that's an English one, and I'll go to the end of this document because the very beginning of the Metamorphoses is full of all sorts of weirdness, and not many people. But so I can tag a word. So there I've tagged the word phaeton, and you see that it pulls up a window, and if this were a place name, I could click on place and it would do a lot of search for me, and it would do a lot of the work in addition for me. But if I click on person, all it does really is it tells me that this is a person, and it allows me to comment on it. And so I can say this is Phaeton, the son of the sun, and various things like this. Or I can add a tag to this. And so among the tags, I could say mythological, and I could add the URI for that person. For example, I could say Wikidata : and then I haven't looked up the actual Wikidata reference for Phaeton, but let's pretend that that's what it is, and I could tag that. And so what I've effectively done here then is first identified that this is a person. So I've done the colored highlighting that I showed in the example. I've typed this information. And then I've also disambiguated it. If you wanted to know which Phaeton there were are 9 different people called Phaeton in ancient mythology. Which one of those is it? It's the one that is described at this Wikidata page there. I'm not going to save this because I would be entering false information, because there probably really is a Wikidata page at Q123456, which has nothing to do with an ancient person. But that's the concept of annotating information in something like Recogito. And the principle behind hypothesis is very similar, except you're not uploading information and annotating it privately. You're annotating pages that are already on the web, just using a browser plugin. But so that's all I really wanted to say about the concept of annotation and showing the use of this interface for that. It's not something that we're going to talk about anymore in this session. It's not the exercise that we're setting, but it is something you might be interested in experimenting with, and I'm sure there will be further mention of Recogito later in Sunoikisis. And if you search through the Sunoikisis repository for mentions of Recogito, it's been mentioned about 10 times in the last 3 years, and so you will find descriptions of that. So I'll pass back over to Rada now, who's going to talk a little bit about what we are suggesting as an exercise.
Thank you, Gabby. Yes, we are going to present the exercises we are proposing a bit in the end of the session. Am I screen sharing?
No, not yet. Okay, yes, now we can see.
Okay, now I am, right? Okay. So, in the exercise we are proposing, we would like you to compare 3 of the main platforms, person data, let's not say prosopographic platforms. So, PIR, LGPN, and Trismegistos. I'm going to open them just quickly. I'm not going to make search demonstrations in them, because we've actually talked about this, and we did demonstrations, extensive demonstrations of all the main online platforms on antiquity. In the previous sessions we taught in Sunoikisis, so in the fall semester of 2017 and the spring semester of 2017. If you want to see the videos with the demonstrations, you can just go to the GitHub pages of those sessions. So we would like you to compare these 3 databases. In order to make the comparison more relevant, we have created a spreadsheet. I've already opened it here, in which you have a number of persons which are attested in both LGPN and Trismegistos. So we can just quickly take a look at the first person. This is the LGPN entry. Shouldn't it open some? And this is the.
So that was the full entry. There wasn't anything further for
no.
that's
the full entry, and this is the Trismegistos page for the same person. So, given this, we would like you to compare, first of all, the interface of the websites and see how the search filters, how you find the search filters, how they are useful. You have an advanced search as well here. So, in what regards they are useful, in what regards they are less useful, and how do these search filters actually help you find people you might be interested in. As well, we would like you to do this here in PIR as well. And you can look at the results you get. So you can look at people entries, compare a couple of the persons which appear in more than one database, try to find some people who appear in PIR as well, and try to see how much information about one person does each database give you. See how the information is structured, which are the similarities and which are the differences, and which are the factors who actually influenced these similarities and the differences. And as an essay, we proposed to take a look at least two of the prosopographical and onomastic databases presented, two or more, of course, of the three presented here, but you can as well relate to other databases we've mentioned in the presentation, or you've come across in reading the bibliography. And you should compare and discuss the data structure and the usability and transparency of each site. If you want to go a bit further with this analysis, you should see to which purpose, to what research goals each site is best fit for, and which do you believe is the intended public for each of the platforms you are referring to. Okay, did I miss anything on the exercises? I think not, right?
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, it's really for students to pick up, look at those things,
yes,
and to see what discussion arises from that. And I think that's,
yes, the point is for the students to have a chance to take a look at each web platform and get familiar with it a bit.
Yeah, because the question, of course, as you say, is precisely what are the research questions that led the designers of these sites to structure them in the way they did? What do they think you're going to use them for? And by extension, who they think is going to use them.
Yes, because they are going
PIR has a much simpler interface and much less information made available to you, which might suggest a certain kind of user is expected for the website there.
Definitely, as well Trismegistos, which has a lot of graphic representations, networks, and the class of users it was intended for might be a bit different. This is for the ones who analyze it too.
And bear in mind, of course, that some of these databases are primary sources, not primary in the sense of being ancient sources, but are the principal sources of this prosopographical data themselves, and others are a way for you to find information which you'll then go and look at a book to find out more. And so that also may be transparent based. You may be able to figure out which ones are which based on that interface.
Yes, and I think it's also interesting to figure out, to see how this is especially for the classic students, for the students who are undertaking digital classics classes, to see how the employed sources basically shaped the platforms, the search filters, the fields, everything, because they are very much related to the sources. Okay, then I believe this is it, right?
These databases are very interesting also because they are expanding beyond persons and prosopography in some way. For example, the LGPN, also the paper edition, is arranged by places in the end because we have different volumes and the organization is a geographical one. But now in the online version, we also have a place catalog in the LGPN.
Yeah.
We can use the LGPN as a geographical reference tool. For example, I'm doing that for my work on the Digital Athenaeus, on the Dayton office. I'm looking for places in the LGPN. So the first focus is places. Of course, in prosopographies, we usually have this information, but now in online versions and in databases, we can really extract geographical information.
Yes.
And we can use them also as gazetteers in some way.
Yes.
Not probably correct, but, and the same for Trismegistos, because definitely with Trismegistos we go beyond list of names, but we have many, many sources, papyri inscriptions, etc. So I think this is super interesting and for students. So starting with a question and then ending with many different possible results. And so, yeah, I think this is a very interesting exercise, not only for classicists and for students of classics.
Yeah.
I'm referring to my students in Leipzig. We have computer scientists. Maybe at the beginning it's difficult for them, but we have transcriptions of ancient names, Greek and Latin names, so it's not difficult to use these tools. You can be a bit lost at the beginning, but there are explanations in English, chronological and geographical references, so you can try to get a sense of what is prosopography or a list of persons.
So remember, one of the cool things about this annotation is it sort of, a lot of it starts with the Hestia project, where they worked on English translations of Herodotus. So this is very accessible. For our CS students, the concept of aligning the English to the Greek or the Latin is an interesting, that's actually something they can conceptualize algorithmically. So anyway, this is a real great entry point, and a lot we can do with a prosopography.
Yeah, it'd be very cool to do something similar with the prosopography, actually, because they were working with place names, weren't they, in Hestia? So it would be very cool to see how that alignment could be pulled out. Yeah.
I mean, I'll never forget how shocked I was. I never had the imagination to think you could actually use the English translation effectively. And it was me being caught up in the details and not realizing the power of using this much more accessible representation. But Elton's a lot smarter than me on that, so kudos to him.
Yeah, and then we can use English as a bridge language, as we do for translation alignment. So we have the English maybe aligned with Greek or with other languages. It's a sort of bridge language, and then we can get other data. So, but in the chat, we have a long comment by...
Yeah, I was just looking at that. So the question seems to be, and Anisa, correct me if, or clarify if I'm not taking this entirely clear, is that you're annotating, your students are annotating names. You're attempting to transcribe new names into a standard Portuguese transcription for the purposes of the dictionary, and you're looking at what XML tags you might use to record that transcription information and all the associated information about the names and those name references. Is that broadly speaking your question, Anita? Yeah. So I think the various kinds of information that you're talking about in here. So name category, identifiers. I guess you can add all those sort of things to a person name tag in TEI. And then linking back to the source. So is this information you're thinking of embedding in the TEI transcription? So if you start off with your text as plain text in Recogito, annotated in Recogito, and then export as TEI, And then presumably some of that information can then be added to the TEI in a different interface, because Recogito won't create any bespoke attributes in the TEI for you. As complicated as you want to make it, I guess, because again, Recogito will only export the fact that you've tagged something as a name, I think, and possibly, yeah, not even. I mean, if you're tagging place names, Recogito would export as a ref attribute the identifier that you've used to disambiguate that name, whether in Pleiades or geonames or similar. But for a person, they don't have that information explicit. You can only record that as tags, and I don't think that the TEI export from Recogito does anything with the tags. You might want to experiment and see whether that's true. Sadly, we don't have any Pelagios people here today, but I think that's the case. So I think any further tagging over and above the fact that something is a name would probably have to be done in the XML then. But or you know, next year ask, or next round later this year, ask Pelagios for a small grant to pilot this, and as a part of that, get them to, you know, to make changes to their software. I'm very keen to work with Pelagios on improving the person handling in Recogito and in their software generally. So I think this would be a really useful exercise to try and do with them. So get them to make changes to their export and see what we can do with it. I think Pelagios are interested in going in that direction for this exercise. So that's certainly a conversation it would be worth. You know, maybe in the first instance, you and someone from Pelagios, or you and I and someone from Pelagios, could really talk about what it is they could do and what the pathway would have to be to get to that, to get that raised in their priority, so that they can do it in the 18 months they've got left of the project. But as a general answer, which would be useful to anyone other than, you know, us who are thinking about new developments, I think the answer is just, you know, in Recogito, for tagging people, you can only really tag it's a person. Any further information would have to be done in a different platform.
Yeah, especially here we have a specific problem for Portuguese, and Anise from Brazil is writing in the chat because she's not sure about her connection. I'm telling this for people watching YouTube. Well, I think that here we have a general problem because we miss many proper names in general in our dictionaries. So this is not only a problem for Portuguese, and Anise is working on this Greek-Portuguese dictionary. So in general, we have this problem for many other modern languages. That's why we still have a problem of disambiguating and adding names in the original language, in Greek and Latin in this case. I know that because I'm working a lot for various Greek sources, so we still miss proper names, personal names and geographical names in the original language. But here, yes, you also have the problem of deciding the correct transcription of Greek proper names into Portuguese. But definitely, yes, I agree with Gabby that this is something going beyond Recogito, in the sense that you have to find a way for adding this information if you have different transcriptions. And then, of course, the community here can discuss forever about different possible transcriptions, but this is definitely an issue. So is 6:13? I don't know if we have other comments or questions in our group. We still have 2 minutes. No questions? Well, I think it was a very, very rich session, so thank you. Every year we have one or more sessions on prosopography and personal data, because as for geographical annotations, our community has been working a lot, and we need data. We need data, and we need to involve not only, in this case, classicists for annotating data, but also computer scientists for working with this data. And every year we have new questions, new issues. So, and okay, yes, thank you. Gabby. Okay, so I think okay that our time is over now. So you have the class outline GitHub with a description of the session, further readings. There is also an interesting paper on digital classics online as a reference paper, and then the exercise explained by Rada and Gabriel before. Next week, we will have another session, different session about programming through Latin. We will have Eleni Buzzia and Angelos Barmpoutis from the University of Florida. And we will see, so a different topic, we will switch to Latin and we'll see how to program through Latin. So as for today, thank you very much, Gaby and Rada, for this great session. And see you next week at 5 p.m. So goodbye, good night for those in this time zone.
Thank you, Monica. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye. See you.